Sometimes I just stop and think about how it happened. It was more of a hobby, an opportunity to escape into a fantasy where anything was possible, rather than a daily routine to keep a roof over your head and food on the table. I was not an office worker, not a lawyer or an accountant, not a technology tycoon, not a special forces soldier, not a doctor. But in my thoughts and in my stories, I could be all that and more. I started by self-publishing on Amazon, and I am now ashamed of how rude they were. When I got better and could afford professional help, I took them down, reworked them into something readable, and posted them again. The money I made in the first year was ridiculous. I didn't break even. It cost me more than I earned from publishing. I was ready to give up when earnings started to improve as I started getting noticed. Then I wrote a 4-book adventure series that really took off. Suddenly, publishers who had previously ignored me wanted to become my new best friends. I signed with one of them on the advice of my new agent and intellectual property lawyer. No advance, but the money I started receiving allowed me to quit my regular job and focus on my new project. It was a Western, and it did quite well. Then I wrote a novel that quickly climbed the bestseller list, reaching the top 20 of several newspapers. Sunday Morning reviewed it, and sales picked up again. Then the movie people came into play, and my agent negotiated with Amazon to do a 3-part adventure series. I was entitled to approximately $250,000 for each part. My agent smiled at my face and said that Netflix was interested in my Western, and Hollywood was watching the progress of my novel, and if it became even hotter, the offer would be in the low end of 7 figures. Darla and I went from making $70,000 a year together to a 7-figure income that kept growing. I had no trouble convincing her to quit her job and become one of the slackers of the rich, or maybe just one of the slackers of the almost rich. We bought toys. She chose a BMW convertible. I bought a new Jeep truck and motorcycle. Then an opportunity presented itself, and we bought a lake house. It was a forced sale, and we got a damn good deal. The owners had legal problems and needed money ASAP. The estimated cost was $450,000, and we bought it for $300,000. Then Darla wanted a sailboat, even though she had no idea about sailing. I bought a fairly large model for the lake, and she began visiting the local yacht club twice a week where she took lessons. I still had the work ethic instilled by years of physical labor. I tried to write 6 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week. Sometimes I simply wasted the day. Other times the words flowed from my fingers to the keyboard. If I was on the go, I could write for 12 hours straight. It may seem like I was throwing money around like a drunken sailor, but I wasn't that reckless. I paid cash for a lake house. Even if we never used it, the deal was too good to pass up. I knew that in today's market, I could almost double my money if I had to sell. I paid cash for vehicles knowing I would lose out on their depreciation. A new car is one of the worst investments in the world. It's done nothing but depreciate in value from the moment it drives off the lot. But we've never owned anything newer than a 6-year-old one, and we allowed ourselves the luxury. I was surprised how little impression it had on dealers. People paying cash was bad for their business because they made money from banks, finance companies, even insurance companies for referring a customer their way. My bike wasn't new, but it was worth a lot more than I paid for it, and it was a damn good ride, and scary fast. And so I sat, thinking that I had the world by the tail. Then everything collapsed. We were still living in our small house because there was too much emotion invested in it to let go. It took us 5 years to save up the down payment, and we were very lucky to buy during the recession of the early 2000s when the housing market crashed. We paid probably 60% of its actual cost, and we worked tirelessly to improve it, pouring every extra penny into it. Now that we had the money, we were talking about expanding it, adding a bedroom or 2, and maybe filling them up not too soon. I was 33 and Darla was 31, and time passed. I worked from home, in a shed that I built specifically for this purpose. It was well equipped and comfortable and had all the amenities of a work office. I told Bobby I needed my space, and it was true. I tried to work from home, but she kept coming in and talking, seriously interfering with my workflow at times. I especially did a lot on the days when she went on a sailboat, which happened today. When we spent time at the lake house, I was still working and had a small office on the first floor. I used the internet almost exclusively for research, but I had a small collection of books that helped me a lot, and I kept them to myself. I thought I needed one of these for a story I was working on, and after searching around the office and part of the house, I realized I had left it at the lake house. Since I was just going to stop by, pick it up, and come right back, I took the motorcycle, covering 25 miles in a surprisingly short time. Of all my toys, this was probably my favorite. There were no cars in the driveway, but I didn't expect it. I parked the bike and ran inside, passing the bedroom on the way to the office. Something made me stop and go back. She stood on the patio, looking out over the lake. She was wearing one of my t-shirts, and one side had slipped off her shoulder, exposing the straps of her black bra. I loved this view so much. She clearly heard me. I liked it too, not anymore. She screamed and turned around sharply, raising her hem and showing off her curvaceous buttocks. Miles, what are you doing here? The better question would be, what are you doing here, almost naked, when you should have been on a sailboat on the lake? I know that look. Who is it? She began to stutter, making excuses, when the door swung open and her sailing instructor walked inside. Damn, sex is so exciting, isn't it, honey? I brought what you wanted and... His voice died when he saw me. Then panic set in. Mr. Molson, it's not what you think. What it looks like is that you're not out on the lake doing what I'm paying you to do. It looked like it was more about sex than teaching, but maybe you were teaching her new things. Don't lie, just leave. And it goes without saying that your services are no longer required, a fact that I will explain in detail to your boss. Go. I don't have transportation. Then walk. You have just enough time to get away before I get to you. But if I catch up with you, all you can do is crawl. Your choice. He was a lean guy, about 5'9" tall, with the deep tan of someone who spends a lot of time on the water, good cheekbones and handsome eyes. I was going to shut them both down, maybe knock that dimple out of his chin, and he realized it. He was already 2 steps ahead of me when he rushed to the door, and I stood and watched as he ran down the driveway. When I turned around, she was standing behind me. Dear I. Just stop, Darla. It is what it is. You couldn't be happy, could you? You wanted everything, and you almost got it. Now you'll get a little, but it won't be what it could have been. You'll never have to again. Work as a waitress, but you may have to go back to work. I want you to think about me sometimes when your legs hurt, or when your last lover leaves, and realize what you've lost. She let out a small, strangled cry and reached towards me. Don't touch me. I'm not sure how I'll react. Go sit on the couch. Now. Darla jumped at the volume of my voice and hurried to the couch. I took the moment to walk out the door, pausing long enough to take out the knife I'd carried since I was 12 and slash 2 of her tires. Knowing that it would take her time to replace them, I was in no hurry to go home. Driving a motorcycle while angry is not a good idea, so I tried to remain calm. When I got home, I packed a small backpack, got back on the motorcycle, and rode for 6 hours before stopping in a small town in Virginia. I checked into a small private motel, paying cash. I had to provide a credit card as a guarantee, but if they didn't use it, there would be no record of my stay. The owners recommended a small restaurant within walking distance, and the simple food was well prepared and seasoned, overall very satisfactory. I memorized everything for future use in a scene in one of the novels. By the time I left, I was already an old friend, and 2 different couples offered to take me back to the motel. I thanked them but told them I needed to go for a walk to warm up after 6 hours on the bike. I stayed the next night and went to the local mall for a change of clothes, choosing jeans and a t-shirt. I returned to the motel, and the 60-year-old woman who drove it was waiting for me. Miles Molson, I knew you were familiar to me. Will you sign my book? She had 3 books. 1 for her, 2 for her friends. Wait until the girls in my book club see this. A real living writer staying at my motel. I wish they could meet you. The lady was very kind in the short time I knew her, and it made me smile. When is your meeting? Tonight. Why do you ask? How about having a writer speak to your club? It would be nice to talk to real people for a change. I seriously thought she was going to faint. Are you serious? It's better than looking at the walls and the TV tonight. But I'm going to need one thing. She insisted on taking me to the local bookstore. I was amazed that independent bookstores still existed, and I bought every copy of my latest novel they had in stock. Before I left, I posed for a few photos, including one in front of the store where the logo was clearly visible. The only thing I asked was that the photos not be published for at least 24 hours. By then, I will be far away. All 12 ladies from the book club were delighted, but it only lasted 45 minutes. Then came, with the candor of small town and country people, questions which, while not offensive, were thought-provoking. Why did this character go in this direction when the other one chose not to? What made me reconcile the lovers in the end? Shouldn't she have been punished more for her misdeeds? Then I understood. I didn't need to punish Darla. I just needed to get her out of my life. Yes, she'll probably end up with a few $1 million, but how long will she have it? I already have 7 new novels planned, and I don't have to work on them before the divorce. Then she will have no rights to any profits I earn. My money will hopefully continue to come in and increase, while hers soon dwindles to 0. At the end of the meeting, I thanked the ladies for their hospitality, and after about 1 million photos, we parted. Marge insisted that I have breakfast with her and her family before I left the next morning, and her husband made me sign an action-adventure he had, telling me how much he enjoyed it. I promised them copies of my new works as soon as they came out, and headed my motorcycle south. Before I left, I turned on my phone, listened to the almost constant pings as all the messages and texts came in, and called my lawyer. He seemed glad to hear from me. After he spoke, I asked him a few questions. I know this is not your area of expertise, so I want you to find me a really good divorce lawyer, and I need your advice on how to protect future profits so they don't end up in my soon-to-be ex's pockets. Tell me what I needed to be done, and helped organize it. When you find someone, report it as soon as possible. Our laws do not require an explanation of the reasons for divorce, so simply state the irreconcilable differences and ask her not to complicate the situation. If she does, tell her I'm willing to hold out. It's endless, but all expenses will be at her expense according to her part of the contract. My intellectual property lawyer had been working for 30 years and had encountered this situation many times, so he called an old friend who had a reputation as the toughest shark in the state, and she agreed to represent me. He also told me to stop working on whatever I was doing, and if I couldn't do it, then not to tell anyone. At his insistence, I called a lawyer and explained the situation. She asked me some very direct questions about my fidelity and breathed a sigh of relief after my answers. What's on the surface we can't deny, and we can't avoid paying her what she deserves. I'm very glad you don't have a problem with that. I have to ask, if you're being so generous with her, is there a chance for reconciliation? If so, you can save a lot of money by stopping it now. I have no problem giving her what she's due. She supported me when many people laughed or dismissed my writing as stupid, then laughed at the same people when I became successful. She deserves some of that money, but not what I earn in advance. How difficult will it be? It's not at all difficult if you don't post anything until at least 3 months after the divorce. I can wait 6 if I have to. Then I'll have to give something to the publisher. Otherwise, it's a breach of contract. Do you think she will resist? I have no idea, but at one point I didn't think she would cheat. If she resists or tries to insist on counseling, I will become unavailable. I may have to do some research that will take me out of the country for a while. It might work, it might not. A lot depends on the judge we get. Are your assets protected? I didn't even think about it, but we really didn't have a lot of cash in the bank back then, maybe 25 to 30,000. I checked after I hung up, and there was $10 left in the account. We had 5 credit cards, and I hastily canceled them all. I called the lawyer again, and she told me not to worry unless it was needed, and we would take it out of the agreement. She instructed me to contact the bank and my investment advisor, who liquidated a couple of assets and transferred 50,000 to a new account in my name only. He then froze all funds until the divorce was finalized. The next day, I received a new credit card and used it while traveling. Before continuing on my way, I returned to the yacht club and asked to speak to the manager. He appeared smiling and asked if my wife had enjoyed learning to sail. I have no idea. As far as I can tell, all her instructor taught her was to be better in bed. I just wanted to tell you to your face what your employee is doing, and to let you know that future lessons will not be paid for by me. You can check if the payment went through if she continues to engage. I could sue. I wouldn't win anything, but I would make sure that it would cost you personally and the club a lot of money in legal fees. Scoundrel immediately, and this will all be over. The manager didn't even blink. I'm really sorry. It's not our intention to destroy marriages. He'll be back from class in about 15 minutes. Would you like to be present when he's dismissed? Since you asked so politely. 20 minutes later, the bastard approached the pier with a boat and tied it to the parking lot. The woman he was training looked like a typical 40-something housewife, but he rubbed her ass and whispered in her ear. She winced and buttoned her blouse just as the manager approached. Good lesson, Mrs. Martin. Did Alvin teach you anything today? Alvin. Seriously. Suddenly, I had a mental image of him as a chipmunk, and it made me smile. Mrs. Martin answered shyly. The manager nodded with a smile. I'm afraid this will be your last lesson for a while, unless you find another instructor. My other 3 are busy until the cold weather. Alvin will be leaving us soon. Alvin seemed surprised, and as the woman hurried away, the manager grabbed him by the collar. I had a very interesting conversation this morning, Alvin. Are you familiar with the name Miles Molson? He turned pale. His wife is one of my students. Yeah, student. Mr. Molson told me that you've been teaching her some very interesting things all this time. I warned you the last time my husband complained. You'll have to leave, Alvin. Empty your locker and leave the premises. You're not allowed to come here. My father. He will be in full agreement when I discuss this with him at dinner this evening. Remember, he is one of the founders of this club and chairman of the board. He will be very unpleasant if rumors of your misdeeds begin to spread. I think you know how frustrated he will be. 5 years of college, and you're not even close to finishing your degree. I'm giving you free advice. You should hold on tight to your butt for the next 2 months, or you might find out how cold the world can be, especially if you're paying your way. Bills. Go now, take your things and leave. He sighed, slumping his shoulders, and turned, looking straight at my smirk. I must take revenge on you. You can try. Let's see how your training compares to village kung fu. The Commodore, as everyone who knew him called him, laughed. Alvin, play at your leisure, preferably away from here. Go away. Fuck you, old man. I'll beat you first. He looked at me as I laughed. Can I watch you try? The Commodore is a retired special boat service soldier and a veteran of 2 wars. Plus, I know he holds advanced belts in 2 martial arts. Do you mind if I film this? It will look great on Instagram. I can already see the headline. Young punk gets his ass kicked by a 70-year-old man. You'll go viral in no time. He looked between me and the Commodore at our grinning faces. The Commodore spoke in a quiet but humorous voice. That's not entirely true, Mr. Molson. I'm actually 71. I'll be sure to fix this when I post. Alvin realized there was no upside to this situation, so he simply walked past us, muttering and making vague threats. The Commodore sighed and extended his hand. Equally. Equally. Perhaps you can ask my wife if she intends to pay for the parking of her boat. Payment expires in 3 days. I'll discuss this with her. I'm truly sorry about your situation, Mr. Molson. Thank you. I'm sorry too. We shook hands again and I walked away, wondering what kind of reception Darla would give when she came to her next class. But by then Alvin will already call her and tell her everything. I'd love to hear this conversation. I spent the next 4 months offline. I headed south, paying cash and staying under the radar. When I got to Florida, I boarded a plane to Belize, rented a small bungalow, turned on the Wi-Fi, and got to work. I called my lawyer once a month for updates. In the second month, we had a long conversation. She came to see me twice. I turned her down both times, citing ethics. Then she came with a lawyer when she made an appointment. She was very disappointed when I refused to give her your contact. Any more instructions? No. Continue. When will this be heard in court? About a month and a little later. Will you come? Do I have to be there? It would be better if you showed up, but I can plead commitments abroad and the judge might accept that. Maybe not. We'll see. Let me know. To prevent my lawyer from being a liar, I asked my agent to arrange several television shows in Europe, including the Graham Norton show. This was one of his highest-rated shows as I talked about my upbringing, and he couldn't help but laugh when I described snipe hunting to him. The actors on the couch next to me were laughing so hard they needed tissues, and the French star let out a sort of grunt that sparked another burst of laughter. I received a couple of invitations to spend time on a yacht or a country estate, but declined them as gracefully as possible, citing legal obligations. I decided to wear my wedding ring until the end of the divorce process and waved it as a shield when a French woman suggested spending a few days on the Côte d'Azur. She seemed confused that marriage vows could make a difference. I showed up in Germany, Sweden, and Italy in the following weeks, racking up my frequent traveler miles. The Amazon movies came out and were very well received. My publisher tried to move my deadline forward, but I asked my lawyer and agent to stick to guns, promising that I would deliver the work on time. I called my divorce lawyer and she gave updates. You're on the agenda. Next Monday. You don't have to be there, but I suggest you show up. She's challenging the agreement, but once the judge sees it, I have no doubt he'll approve it. Well, okay. I gave her half of everything we had saved up so far, which was almost $3 million. I left our little house to her and insisted on selling the lake house. This was a moot point because she really wanted to keep it. This will never happen. I would burn the place down before I gave her the place she turned into a nest of love to betray me. It will also receive half of the proceeds from the Netflix deal. My business lawyer told me that if I waited long enough for a romance film deal, she might end up getting nothing. Without this, it will still come out to a net amount of about $5 million. She'll keep her car, our little house, and I'll stay with my truck and motorcycle, and we'll go our separate ways. How difficult can it be? Very much, as it turned out. I arrived in town on the day of the trial, not showing up until the case was called. Darla's eyes widened when she saw me, and she tried to get up, but her lawyer held her down. She looked very neat, but seemed to have lost a little weight. She should be happy about that. She always said she wished she were 10 pounds lighter. The judge was an older woman with a steely face, and she praised me for being transparent about our financial situation. Most men, especially at your level of wealth, would fight it tooth and nail. Until I caught her sleeping with someone else. We were complete partners in everything we did. She deserves what she gets, and I'm not complaining about it. Your wife insists on counseling. How do you feel about this? Madam, Your Honor, we grew up in very humble circumstances. I was raised in the Baptist church and am very conservative in matters of fidelity. So, While I have no objection to the division of our assets, I do not see the need to continue our marriage. She violated my trust in her, and she'll never get him back. In my opinion, trust is on par with love in a marriage commitment. No amount of counseling in the world could convince me otherwise, so I think we'll be wasting everyone's time. She looked at me for a minute and sighed. Okay, this marriage is dissolved here and now. Mr. Molson, Mrs. Molson, you are no longer husband and wife. Try to live well and don't find yourself in front of me again. Next thing. Darla's lawyer jumped up from his seat in outrage. That's it. No chance for reconciliation. Unless one of the parties wants it. No, she's getting a very good deal. She's young, still attractive, gets a pretty big chunk of money, so she's not in danger of destitution, and she should be able to start over. Maybe she'll learn some lessons, or maybe not. I don't need to remind you that this is a state without specifying the reasons for divorce. And if one party does not want to be married, he does not even have to explain why. Leave it as it is. And just like that, I was no longer married. She tried to change the financial agreement twice. Once when my new book came out and again when the movie deal was finalized. But my lawyers worked hard and it was unsuccessful. Her final share of our fortune was just over $6 million. My fortune seems to have increased during our partition. Most people live their entire lives without accumulating that much. She should have been happy. It took her about 1.5 years and $1 million spent to become sustainable again. I believe at some point she came to her senses, kicked out someone who shared her bed, and took stock of her life. Darla put her house up for sale and moved to the big city, bought a condominium, and went to college. She was a good student and was always upset that we couldn't afford college. I didn't know what her major was, and the only reason I knew anything was because her sister was still my friend on Facebook. I found that I enjoyed my time traveling on a motorcycle, so every couple of months I would go on a week-long trip. Just pick a direction and go. I've always loved long hair, and now that I had the means to let it go. I didn't like beards, so I stayed shaven, always wore good clothes, and almost never encountered the police on my travels. One police officer in South Carolina caught me driving just 4 miles per hour over the speed limit. Perhaps the small town needed money and started adding points to the fine. I didn't complain, although he pushed me, hoping to get a chance to send me to prison. He was shocked when I showed up in court on the appointed day and asked to see the footage from his body camera. He spat and stammered before admitting that he turned it off when he went to the toilet and forgot to turn it back on. There was a big discussion about whether this recording was admissible, and I shrugged and let my lawyer tell them that if they rejected it, it would be on social media before I left the parking lot. The judge looked at the tape in his office, came out, dismissed all the charges except the speeding ticket, fined me $100, and released me. The policeman and prosecutor were having a deep discussion with the judge as I left. I left the city as quickly as possible. I did get beat up in a little bar in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, in a fight that I didn't start or have any interest in, but when the bar fight started, they must have thought I was with other guys. When the police figured it out, they wanted to know what my connection was. I don't have one. I just stopped for a beer. The deputy sheriff smiled as she returned my license. Wrong place at the wrong time, huh? Well, at least you can put it in the book. She recognized the name, and before they left, we had to take a photo with both groups of police. The owner's wife wanted a photo, as well as some visitors. I had a few more beers with them before the police hottie followed me to my hotel, then returned after work. We spent most of the weekend in bed, only going out to eat. She followed me on Facebook and other social networks, and I sent her the book from time to time. Wanda invited me to her wedding. They seemed very happy together. One of the reasons I liked hanging out in bars and small eateries was because of the stories I heard. Many of them have appeared in my works to one degree or another, and I have smiled when I receive messages saying that they saw almost the same thing, or that the event from the book actually happened to them. I probably wrote about them. Over the next 3 years, I released another Western, a novel, and a fantasy set in a post-apocalyptic world. They all sold well, but the fantasy was the most successful, which surprised me a lot. All of them were offered to film production companies. I was invited to the set of a fantasy work, and I spent 2 days there, enthusiastically learning the tricks of the makeup artists and special effects specialists. I met the stars briefly, but spent most of my time not with them. I enjoyed watching magic being created more than magicians performing tricks. Those who were involved in Westerns found out about this and also invited me. I even appeared in the movie as Bad Guy #3 where I was hanged. It was a little creepy, but the setup was safe and the loop was loose, just in case. They told me not to shave for 4 or 5 days. Then I sat in the makeup chair where they oiled my hair, rubbed mud into my face, and painted my teeth. I definitely didn't look like the main character when they were done. I asked them not to credit me in the film because it was just fun, and they smiled, saying that most writers would like to be credited. I didn't approach the novel, although when I saw the bedroom scene at the premiere, I regretted not being involved. I traveled, I dated, I had 2 fairly long-term relationships, but they both fizzled out. Darla graduated from college with a degree in interior design and sent me an invitation. I didn't go, but I sent her a very nice graduation gift and referred a couple of people to the company where she worked. I was in the publisher's office discussing contract details when I met Helen. She was of average height and could use about 15 pounds to lose, but she wore them well and was generally very attractive. The word lush came to mind. She had a cute little mouth, a snub nose, jet black hair, and very blue eyes. I kept wondering where I saw her, and my agent noticed. This is Helen Montoya, host of one of the most popular cooking shows on television. She's here to negotiate her 3rd cookbook. She doesn't sell like you, but she makes very good money. Then I realized why she seemed familiar to me. I had one of her cookbooks. I noticed her looking at me a few times, so she probably knew who I was. She often spoke about the difficulties of cooking for one because she was recently divorced, and this was the theme of the final season of her show. Plucking up my courage, I approached her. If you could eat anywhere in the world, where would your next meal come from? She seemed a little taken aback before smiling. This is one of the most original dating phrases I've ever heard. My choice may surprise you. It would be at Tommy's Drive-In in my hometown. I would kill for one of their yummy burgers, fully loaded, generously loaded French fries and onion rings. She was surprised when I said that I knew this place and had eaten there twice. This led to a conversation about road food. I told her about a Chinese restaurant in Boone, North Carolina that was in an old farmhouse, and all the rooms had been converted into private little dining rooms. Then I told her about a plate of fatty meat I once ordered at a small diner in Greer, South Carolina. She talked about the crab cakes at a seafood restaurant in Maryland and the lamb barbecue she once ate in a small town in Tennessee. This led to a discussion of barbecue in general, from all the southern states and a few western ones. Damn, now I'm hungry. I looked at my watch and smiled. When I signed my last contract, my publisher made a big deal out of giving me a Rolex. I accepted him gratefully, allowing him to have his moment, and then met him a week later and returned him. He was shocked to the core. Don't think I don't value it, because I do. It's just that I can't in good conscience own something so valuable when it's just a matter of time. If you want to do something for me, sell it and give it to graduate students. Maybe high school students who need a little support. Think of it as preparing your next generation of clients to make you even richer. I think he liked the idea. He advertised the scholarship in the local newspaper and on social media, saying it was my idea. He even reached out to other writers for help and was surprised by the response. A camp was organized and workshops were held by 4 writers, including myself. These were mainly questions about how and what to write. The technical aspects are quite simple, at least for some. I want you to understand that there is a difference between writers and storytellers. Writers do serious things. Storytellers just want to entertain you with a good book. And the advice to write about what you know? Bullshit. You're 15 or 16, and while you probably know more about real life than I ever will, that doesn't mean you know everything. I'll tell you one of my secrets, and I'll admit that I stole it from another writer. Dick Francis was a professional jockey. He traveled for the Queen of England and was very successful. Then he was injured at the races and could no longer race, so he switched to journalism, writing about what he knew about horses and racing. Then he started writing detective stories, and if you've read any of them, you'll notice that each one has some sort of horse-related theme. This is what he knew, but often it was intertwined with something completely unrelated, and usually another professional was at the center of the plot. A pilot, a truck driver, a wine merchant. They all had something to do with horse racing. That's what I'm doing. I take a central theme and then move away from it. If it's about a doctor, I do my research and try to get as little technical as possible, but still throw in bits and pieces to convince you that he really is a doctor. Research should not be underestimated. Same goes for soldiers, accountants, rock stars. Tell their stories using their professions as background. Besides writing workshops, we did fun things. They were old enough to enjoy canoeing, horseback riding, hiking, and other outdoor activities. I smiled at them, knowing that they would be recording their experiences for future reference. My publisher did give me another watch, worth about $2,000, and I still felt it was too much. My expensive watch showed that it was 11 in the morning. You know, if we leave now, we'll avoid the rush. I know a burger place that will blow your mind. It's not Tommy's, but it's pretty close. 10 minutes later, we were in my truck. 15 minutes later, we arrived at a real drive-in with waitresses on roller skates. The grill they use was made in 1947 and has never been washed with soap. The spices are so soaked in it, they will never come out. The milkshake machines were made between 1960 and 1965, completely refurbished. They have 12 flavors of shakes, all made with ice cream that they churn in-house. Their specialty is the fries, so your order can have seasoned fries, regular fries, straws, all mixed together with 1 or 2 onion rings. Helen's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she even applauded when our waitress took our orders, stood up on her skates, and did a 360-degree circle, stopping right at our window. I gave her 100 to split with 2 others, and they showed off, twisting and squirming, passing each other by millimeters to spare and ending up jumping in tandem over a picnic table. We managed to eat all of the 3-pound burgers, but most of the fries were left on the tray. Helen managed to weed out the onion rings and get rid of them. The shock we received almost finished us off, and we found ourselves on the verge of a food coma. Helen surprised me by getting out of the car and following the girl into the building, turning around to invite me inside. She spent 15 minutes talking with the owner and grill master. He told her that his cousin in Louisiana had had a similar operation and always admired it when he visited, so when he had money, he opened his own. I had to take a photo of the entire crew with Helen in front of the building. The owner blew it up and hung it over the door. Then one of the waitresses recognized me and Helen grinned, ingratiating herself with me. Before we left, we both had to sign ticket books and a bunch of menus. She groaned as we pulled into the garage. I'll have to spend the rest of the day at the gym or else the food will go right up my ass. Well then, good food. I'm going to take a nap. She looked up and saw me grinning, so she relaxed. I held the door when we returned to the office. It was nice meeting you, Helen. I have one of your cookbooks and watch your show from time to time. This has inspired me to create a small garden, and I have one section just for herbs. As per your advice, put them in boxes and pots, and even then the oregano seems to try to crawl out every time I'm not there. I've read most of your books and watched a couple of films. High Noon at the End of the Universe is one of my favorite films of all time. It was a lot of fun writing it. Space westerns seem to be doing well. We talked for a few minutes before she had to go to the office. 3 weeks later, I was watching her show, and she shared photos of the diner I took her to, telling her audience what a good time she had and how good the burgers were. There were several photos of us together, and she smiled at the screen. If you're wondering, my companion was Miles Molson. We work at the same publishing company and met there. He took me to Mel's Drive-In when I told him how much I missed the burgers I used to buy at different places. He's a lot of fun to be around. I wonder why he hasn't called me yet. Miles, if you're watching, I'm still single. Hint, hint. She was laughing. While most of her genre wore professional chef attire, she always looked like she was at a fashion shoot rather than in the kitchen. She favored flowy dresses with a hint of cleavage, and I'm sure a lot of guys followed that as well as the recipes. Her hair was always pulled back into a sexy bun with flowing strands. Her dressing style was like a 50s housewife meets a high-fashion diva, and she pulled it off perfectly. After getting the show's phone number from my publisher, I called and left a message. She must have been on set because she called back less than 2 hours later. I think you watched the show yesterday. Is there something you would like to ask me? I see, directly and to the point. Helen, would you like? Yes, I would do it. I'll text you my address. Be there at 7 and wear a suit. We're going to one of my favorite places. I'm sure you'll like it. We talked a little more until she had to go back in front of the cameras, and a few times before we left. I put on one of my suits that I bought while I was in England and drove off in my Cadillac. Her dress was understated but stunning. It was made to her measurements by a leading fashion designer. We fit right in with the five-star restaurant crowd. I recognized several visitors, famous politicians, theater and film actors, and several sports figures. Everyone seemed to know who everyone else was, and by unspoken agreement they left each other alone, except for the occasional friendly greeting. Some of the things she insisted I try I didn't like at all, but I did like a lot of them. We ate as lightly as possible, but it was a 5-course meal, not including dessert. The confidentiality agreement disappeared when we showed up. There were several paparazzi hanging around, taking pictures of everyone who entered or exited. Don't pay any attention to them, she said as she approached our car. When she arrived, she looked around, and I was no longer there, and I was talking to them. They were very surprised, and when Helen returned, we even posed for a few photos together. She was unhappy with me when we left. Why did you do that? Research for one of my next books. I've always wanted to do a murder mystery, and I bet these guys have a story to tell. What did the actor from the past say? Any advertisement is good advertising. Besides, we're just on the B list at best, and as soon as a big name comes along, we'll be roasted. I didn't know it then, but I heard her. She considered herself a lister of the highest order. She was just as hot in bed as I expected, and despite her size, she was incredibly athletic and flexible. People were used to seeing us at events, and she often mentioned me on her show. One day she giggled while preparing a dish and said, "Miles hates this." I realized pretty quickly that we were from different worlds. She took me home to Texas for her parents' 30th birthday. It looked like an English mansion had fallen right into the middle of a cattle ranch. Seriously, the area had to be fenced off to keep the longhorns from eating up the landscape. Her father was big and incredibly powerful. He kept me in his library, and after the third brandy and the second cigar, I seemed to lose it. Let me be clear. If we ever get serious and get married, I will marry her, not my family, especially not you. It would be in your best interests to leave us alone. He was using about 5 shades of red and was still trying to formulate words when I walked out. Helen found me at the fountain in one of the luxurious gardens on the grounds. What did you tell Dad? I told him to mind his own business. I saw her jump a little in the moonlight and then start giggling. What did he say? I don't know. I didn't wait until he could talk again. I think the shock that someone cared about his opinion left him speechless. He'll take care of you now. And this should bother me. Why? Well, if we stay together, family get-togethers will be incredibly awkward. No, it will not. If he remains calm and polite, so will I. If he gets on his pompous high horse, I'll make it a point to kick him out of the saddle." She was silent for a minute. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" "Not really. We never really talked about our parents. This is Emilio Montoya. Among other things, he owns Montoya Avionics. He developed equipment that is found in every aircraft that flies in the air. Dad is considering teaming up with another tech giant to develop a rocket ship designed for space tourism. He is about 3 years old, from becoming a trillionaire." "Well done. Wait, I thought your husband was Montoya." She giggled again. "No, Dad made me promise to never change my name and that all my children would bear his name. Every person I have ever met, unless he was a dirty gold digger, would never give up his rights to the name. Does he really think he can get away with this? This is Emilio Montoya. Of course he can." She didn't know it then, but for us it was the beginning of the end. I told her in no uncertain terms that all my children would bear my name. No negotiations. There was no reason in the world why I could change my mind. Dad said he would make sure I never got a penny of his money unless I followed his wishes. Well, then, when you marry, it's better to marry someone you can control, because that won't suit most men. Besides, if you value money more than any potential partner, your relationship is doomed from the start. I bet so. Besides, it would be a pretty harsh prenuptial agreement, wouldn't it? She refused to answer and left. I was about to enter when I felt someone's presence. This was her mother, a true Southern belle in every sense of the word. "Helen told me what you told my husband. I just wanted to thank you. It had been a while since he'd encountered someone whose plans didn't include kissing his ass. Perhaps this will give him the reality check he needs. I didn't do anything that anyone else would have done. That's not necessarily the case. Our wealth seems to frighten most people, especially men romantically involved with our daughter." We talked for about an hour. She urged me to be patient with Helen, since the absence of her father's influence seemed to benefit her. I told her what she said about children, and from the look on her face, I think it was news to her. She sighed. "He wasn't like this when we got married. The success, the enormous success he achieved, went to his head and gave him an exaggerated sense of self-esteem." "How do you tolerate him?" Her teeth gleamed in the moonlight. "When we started, we had nothing, so there was no need for a prenuptial agreement. When he became more successful, he had the nerve to present me with a postnuptial agreement. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when I tore it up, in front of him and his lawyer. Now he treats me like gold, knowing that I am the goose that can break the golden egg. If we split up and I get 50% of his share of the company, anyone I partner with can take over. And forcing him out of his position, I think that sometimes keeps him up at night." Looking at her, I wondered if I could live like this, but fortunately, this was not my life. She showed me an empty bedroom, and I lay down for the night. The next morning, Helen had little to say to me, and her father did not dine with us. Her mom was in a good mood and teased her a little, making me smile. It was a little chilly on the way back to the airport. A week later, we kissed and made up, but that conversation was always in the back of my mind. Each of us had a separate house, but in fact, we lived together. She usually visited her family once a month, and I always seemed to be immersed in research, so I missed most of it. 8 months later, Helen was persistently hinting at a ring. I decided to be frank. "I have deep feelings for you, Helen. I could love you very easily, but let me ask you something. Would you marry me even if I insisted that all our children bear my name?" "Well, I'm a man who wants total commitment from a partner, and I would never ask for a prenuptial agreement. Look me in the eye and tell me you can do it, and I'll go shopping for the rest of the week." She left and never returned. I talked to her twice after that, and both times she was cool towards me. I chalked it up to a lesson learned and let her go, but she couldn't. She announced on her show that we were no longer a couple because I lacked foresight and was a very superficial person. Then she started throwing juicy tidbits into the gossip and showing me what I was also missing in the bedroom. I never reacted to anything until she showed up at the Emmys drunk with a country singer who could barely be called a man and told everyone she was glad she had found a real man who knew what to do in bed with a lady unlike me. I took revenge in the only way a writer could. I included her and her father in my next novel, and both characters came across as shallow, petty people who should be avoided if at all possible. It sold very, very well. When a reviewer asked about it, I admitted that they inspired my characters, using the old adage about writing what you know. This prompted threatening letters from several lawyers, but I had been in the game long enough to know how close to the line I could get, and I also had a pretty awesome team of lawyers. I also had a secret weapon. The two paparazzi I befriended during my research became, if not friends, then close acquaintances. One even warned me about Helen before I went too far. You need to be careful with her, man. Her father punishes everyone who says a bad word about her. There have been several incidents, as well as interesting photographs, that have been crushed or ransomed over the past few years. One guy who didn't stop was beaten badly. When the Grammy Awards took place, he was one of the photographers and followed them into the party, sneaking into the building across the street and filming everything from the third floor. He called me first and offered me photographs. I gave him everything he asked for and sent one each to her and her father. It showed how she had gone crazy, in a dress up to her waist, with a man, and more than one. There was a note attached to the picture. "It's over, we're done, and I will not tolerate another derogatory comment or innuendo from any of you. Anyone, even if it's soft, and that photo appears on the internet. Never say my name in public again." Emilio was smart enough not to approach me, so he sent a team of lawyers offering stupidly large sums of money for the rights to what I had. I sent him another photo with a clear message. "No, leave me alone, and this will never see the light of day." 18 months later, I saw the cover of the Wall Street Journal, which featured Emilio and his wife in separate photographs. She filed for divorce, citing infidelity. Apparently, she had been planning this for quite some time. Since before the split, she managed to accumulate enough shares on her own to become the controlling shareholder after she received half of his shares. He would work for her if she would let him stay. I smiled all day. Over the next 6 years, Helen married and divorced 3 times, but she never had children, so there was no dispute over the right to the name. Her mother married a man who was richer than her 3 years after the divorce. I saw her and her new husband in Monaco when I was there for the premiere of my 8th film. We had a nice dinner, and she told me that she hoped I would be the one her daughter needed. I told her that I wish I had been on stage 30 years ago, because now she would have been my wife. She flushed red, and her new husband tried his best not to laugh. She turned around and told him that if I did that, he would just be a casual acquaintance. Then she laughed and kissed him deeply. They invited me to go on a cruise for a few days on their yacht, and I had to refuse, but I honestly promised to go with them next time if they warned me in advance. They made me promise, so I think they were sincere. Helen's show was canceled despite Dad's money. She wrote a few more cookbooks and started a YouTube channel, but she didn't have many subscribers and gradually fell into obscurity. Myra told me that after leaving, she returned to her father. Again, who knew? Of course, I didn't want to. I was thinking about how my life was going when I went to bed that night. I had just spent the afternoon and evening talking to some of the richest people in the world, and they seemed to accept me as one of their own. Quite a big leap for a guy from the country who never went to college. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I didn't feel intimidated or excited by who they were. It didn't matter if a woman was wearing a $50,000 designer dress or a $15 one from Walmart. Underneath that they were the same beings. The same applied to men. A tailored suit and a pocket full of money did not make you any different from a guy in jeans and a t-shirt. Each of them had their own dreams, triumphs and disastrous failures, just on a different scale. I came up with as many story ideas as I got from people in the small bars, coffee shops, and diners I frequented, with very minor differences. My last one was a romance, a story like the fairy tale of Cinderella, where a woman was rich beyond the man of her wildest dreams, which I learned through my ability to cross both worlds. Bidding for the rights to the film has already heated up, although the book has only been on sale for 3 weeks. The premiere ended, the obligations were fulfilled, and I returned home. Now home for me meant my 4-room house on the same lake as the old one. Darla was furious when I insisted on selling it, and neither of us got it. But my lawyer had a good conversation with her lawyer and informed him of how long and expensive the divorce would be if she didn't agree. It still took 3 months for her to agree. It didn't really matter. She had her own money now and could buy whatever she wanted. So she bought a house 5 doors down from our old one. When I bought mine, I made sure it was as far away as possible, but still on the same side of the lake. She finally learned how to sail a sailboat, and I saw her on the lake from time to time. I bought a pontoon and a speedboat. The choice depended on how many people I had with me. One day, when Helen and I were on the lake, I saw her boat and pointed to it. She smiled and walked closer, taking off her bikini top. I said hello, and she looked down and smiled until she saw Helen sunbathing on the bow of the boat. She made a sharp turn that nearly capsized and collided with us, screaming as she swam away. I wasn't as impressed with the trick as Helen was, and she laughed about it until I asked her to stop. Now there was a new woman in my life, and she demanded a lot of attention. Brenda was her name because she was a brindle, an American bully breed that looked like a pit bull on steroids. My editor's wife bred them and was delighted to show off her new offspring. They were about 7 weeks old, and when I petted them, Brenda refused to share the attention and monopolized it. I tried to buy it, and Joan laughed. "See this new house? You helped pay for it by sending new writers to Tim. Pay for her paperwork and the rest of her vaccinations, and we'll be even." Joan also taught Brenda to follow simple commands and behave properly. She offered security guard training, but it confused me, so I declined. "Okay, but understand this. These dogs are very good-natured, but they are territorial, and if they or someone they consider part of their pack is threatened, they may react badly." I hoped that Brenda loved 2 other things besides me: horse riding and children. She let the babies crawl all over her, tug at her skin and ears, all the while shaking happily. I visited my parents with my sister, brothers, their families, friends, and about 10 children ranging in age from 10 to 18 months. Brenda was delighted as they chased each other around the yard and rolled on the grass. Their neighbor kept a pit bull on a chain and often taunted Brenda, saying she looked like a blow-up doll of a real dog. I just smiled. You may have that opinion, but think about it. My dog has a large fenced backyard where she can play, and she sleeps in my house, and I take her everywhere with me if I let him. You keep yours on a chain, and maybe pet him. It once or twice a day. I'm sure if he had a choice, he would be at my house in a heartbeat. Brenda could use this guy, but then again, she'd probably make him her dog. He took a deep breath to begin his tirade, thought about it, and walked away. He beat me in elementary school, but I beat him every year since middle school. He had a very nice start to a beer belly while I was still lean and toned. He instinctively knew that any confrontation would end badly for him. The afternoon went well until Mom started her obligatory, "Why haven't you married and given me grandchildren yet?" speech. Really? You have 7 grandchildren running around the yard and you're complaining. Looks like you've exceeded your quota. You're missing the point. I once told Brett that he had too many guns. He lost his temper and told me you can never have too many guns. Guns were important to him. Well, I can never have too many grandchildren. I'll seriously consider it, but I still need to meet someone I can really love in order to get married. It might take a while, given my history of failure. She smiled sadly. Mom really liked Darla. Then she perked up. I can wait, but you need to make an effort. It took a promise to make her happy, and I smiled as I drove home, listening to Brenda breathe heavily. She had a rough day, Riding with a bunch of kids can get tiring. It's not that I haven't dated. I've met quite a few interesting women along the way. They were from different walks of life and social stations. I dated a waitress from a small Texas diner for 3 months before she broke up with me, saying I was too much for her. It got me thinking. She had a college degree and I didn't, but still, I was worth more than she would probably ever earn. She worked as a waitress just to keep herself busy. Her parents had money and she had no financial problems. It all seemed strange to me, and when she made her speech, I even felt relieved. Then I dated a singer from Detroit who dropped out of high school in the ninth grade, but, through sheer will and sheer talent, rose to the top of the music charts. When it seemed like we were getting closer, she ended the relationship, saying that demographic studies showed that I was too white for her and it was hurting her sales. I guess it showed me where her priorities lie. Sometimes it seemed to me that I would never find a suitable companion, because I had acquired the habit of completely isolating myself when I began to write, disappearing into my study for weeks at a time. However, if I had a family, I might reconsider my priorities. I would often fear that I would run out of ideas, but then a news article or an overheard conversation at a diner or bar would start my creative process again. I met Darla at the yacht club, where they were celebrating the Commodore's retirement. He was 75 years old, and the board wouldn't mind if he died in office. But he wanted to retire to the islands, which was quite uncertain, so they had to let him go. I became, if not a friend, then a warm acquaintance. When I had a maritime question for one of my novels, he was the first person I turned to, so I took him to dinner and asked him questions. When I needed advice for my novel about a retired military man, his years of service gave me everything I needed. I paid him a consulting fee and mentioned him in the preface. He was a big fan of maritime history and often spoke of his fascination with the failed attempt to find the fabled Northwest Passage, which led to the death of Admiral Franklin and the crews of both his ships. Strangely, more sailors seemed to die from lead poisoning than from the elements as a result of using lead-sealed canned food. As a retirement gift, I had a replica of HM's Terror, Admiral Franklin's flagship, made in a large bottle, and he was moved when he opened it. As we mingled with the crowd, I came face to face with my ex. She seemed a little dazed, but when I didn't try to decapitate her on the spot, she relaxed. It was actually a fairly civil conversation, and we talked about safe topics. She showed me her engagement ring. He's a good man, Miles, quite successful, and I know without a doubt that he loves me. She was waiting for me to say something, so I congratulated her. Then I chuckled. "Have you made him sign a prenup yet?" She laughed. "He's a lawyer in his father's firm, so a prenuptial agreement is mandatory, more for his protection than mine. I met him when I needed to get rid of the comfort boy. I remember reading about it in the local newspaper. She lived with this guy for 2 years when she caught him with someone else and threw him out. He tried to beg for forgiveness, but when she refused, a lawsuit ensued. He sued her for child support, arguing that she should support him in the standard of living to which he was accustomed. This whole situation was funny. His lawyer told him he had no chance, but he persisted, and when they appeared before the old-fashioned judge who liked order, he was demolished. After reviewing the evidence, the judge did not even go into the office to think about it. He hit the hammer hard. The claim is dismissed for several reasons, including lack of legal basis. Sir, you must have lived with someone for 7 years as husband and wife to be eligible, and you lived with her for 26 months. You did not work the entire time you were together, and she supported you, so I believe that any debt she owes to you is paid off. You are young, healthy, and have a college education, and with the current job market, you should have no problem finding a decent job. The claim is denied." Her lawyer stopped the judge. "Your Honor, my client would like her property back. The man drives the car she bought, and it is registered in her name." Her ex flared, "She gave me this car. It's mine." The judge looked at Darla. She smiled, enjoying the whole situation. "Your Honor, I bought the car because he needed transportation. I paid for it, it's registered in my name, and I never said it was his. But if it's that important to him, he can keep it. I just have to re-register it in my name and pay the last 17 payments. It will be. From what I understand, this is a Camaro convertible that cost over 70,000 new, so you're getting a great deal. Get all the paperwork done in no later than 2 weeks, and if you don't find financing, the car goes right back to her. Is it clear? His lawyer beat him to it before he could say anything. Understood, Your Honor. The lawyer promised to help him and paid off the loan, and as soon as the car was re-registered in his name, the lawyer took it for unpaid legal fees. I was smiling about it when Darla suddenly said, "Don't you dare put that in the book. It's already halfway written. You'll be glad to know that your character came out of the story like a rose, met her Prince Charming, and lived happily ever after. Life imitates fiction, it seems." She fell silent for a minute. I let it get the better of me, living on a shoestring all these years, and then having all this money warped my reality. Like your uncle said during tax time, when all these people got the tax credit, that they all got rich peasants. Well, it was me. I just went to the extreme. If this means anything, I will regret it for the rest of my life. But I know that you will never forgive me, so I had to move on. This is important now. I'm really sorry. Before I could answer, her new man approached. I looked at his suit, his perfect hairstyle and shiny teeth, noticed a hint of the God complex so often found in doctors and lawyers in his eyes, and wondered if she was mistaken. He then looked at her and faltered when she pulled him in for a kiss, so I knew she was going to be okay. We talked for a few more minutes, and I realized I was making him nervous, so I moved on. I shook hands with the Commodore and told him not to forget me, because when I had a subject that required expert advice, I would call him first, even after he had moved back to Scotland. He really appreciated the gift and told me what his retirement gift would be. I will be joining the crew that is about to take Admiral Franklin's route, and with global warming having such a big impact on the Arctic, we may well be able to complete the legendary passage. I wished him luck and said that he should keep a video diary and post it for the whole world. He liked this idea. Just as I was about to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder. "Let me introduce you to my granddaughter. She came to help me end my life here, something I never knew I needed. Miles Molson, let me introduce you to Fiona Wallace, my second eldest granddaughter." If I had expected to see a fiery-haired Scottish fairy with green eyes and lots of freckles, I would have been sorely disappointed. Fiona had naturally light blonde hair, blue eyes, and was just over 6 feet tall. She looked like a Nordic princess, perhaps Freya from Viking mythology. Her eyes sparkled with amusement as she shook my hand. "Not what you expected." "I didn't expect anything, but if I did, it wouldn't be you. I have a feeling you have Viking blood running through your veins." "Yes, but it's not ancient. My father is Swedish, and I definitely inherited his looks." "Your father must be a very handsome man, then." As soon as it came out of my mouth, I realized what I had said. She burst into laughter as the Commodore struggled to contain his smile. "Not the word I would use to describe him, son. She got his physical traits, but she gets her beauty from her mother." "Well, then they must be a very impressive couple. I'd like to meet them someday." We talked for a few more minutes before someone took the Commodore away for another farewell toast. I was fascinated by this woman, but she lived on another continent, so I wrote it off as a pleasant experience. It will definitely appear in one of my future books. A few minutes later, I left. It was nice, but I have to go. I'm flying to Chile tomorrow for research. Tell your grandfather I'll call him when he's settled. If you're looking for your wife, she's over there." She pointed in the direction I looked to see Darla looking at us, and she looked miserable. "This is not my wife, at least not mine anymore. We have been divorced for over 4 years. Does she know about this? See that handsome man walking towards her? They'll be married in 4 months." She shrugged. I give them a year. I know their type, and they love themselves much more than they could love anyone else, and it makes them feel entitled. You're very perceptive. He's a lawyer. Yeah, the way she said that one word spoke volumes. Well, let's hope for the best. That's very generous of you, considering who you're talking about. Still warm feelings? No, I mean, sometimes I remember what we had, and it makes me sad, but not sad enough to go back to her. If you're wondering, she's the one who cheated. I'm a little cruel about some things, and loyalty is at the top of the list. Either you're faithful or you're not. And if you're not, as far as I'm concerned, we're separated. She sighed. It's interesting to watch someone who sees life so black and white. Are there any shades of gray in your life? Not that I could remember. Well, having cleared up this conversation, I have to go. Early flight tomorrow. It was nice talking to you. Give the Commodore my best wishes. As the British would say, the Commodore was under the driver's seat. It was a good thing Fiona was a big woman. I had a feeling she might have to use some of her muscles before the night was over. She surprised me with a hug, and I found her card when I took off my jacket. Well, I spent a very relaxing and interesting couple of weeks in South America. I have been researching piracy along the coast, and it has a rich history dating back to the 1500s. I hired a local professor as a guide, and we went to places I'm sure tourists have never seen. Most people were open and friendly, but we also visited one remote village that could only be reached on foot or by mule, and to say they were wary of strangers would be putting it mildly. They kind of accepted us the second day, especially after I got drunk on their beer and sang songs while dancing in a circle. I played the harmonica for them, and the village chief loved it so much that I gave it to him as a parting gift. The professor was amazed when they showed us some of their treasures, coins from Portugal, Spain, and Great Britain, most of them in gold. We talked on the way back from the mountain, and he asked me to keep it a secret. I agreed, knowing the wave of treasure seekers that such news would cause. I never told him about the Spanish doubloon in my pocket, a gift from the family I was staying with. I have found that in remote areas, candy is more valuable than money, especially when given to children. I handed the package to my wife, telling me to distribute them wisely. They were smiling like crazy, and I wondered as we walked down the steep slope if they would share. I emailed the Commodore, but Fiona responded and said he was off to find the Northwest Passage and wouldn't be back for months. I hoped he was enjoying his adventure and would definitely contact him when he returned. He was a walking encyclopedia of British maritime history dating back to the Middle Ages. I introduced him to the film team, and they ended up using him as a historical consultant, even mentioning him in the credits. Word spread, and he often gave advice that movie studios were willing to pay for. It was a very profitable business. I wondered what he would think when he found out that the BBC Netflix documentary about his expedition was financed by me through my new production company. Both my agent and my lawyer pushed for it, saying it would give me even more control over my work, and big fees for them. I rested for a week, and then locked myself in my office and started working. Sometimes I had to stop to take notes, which I gave to the Commodore for checking. It wasn't necessary, but when I was writing about a historical period, I wanted to be as accurate as possible. 2 months later, Fiona called. Grandfather has returned, but his adventures have taken a toll on him. I heard her as she moved until I decided that they couldn't hear her. He looks bad, Miles. I think he should never have left, but it was his lifelong dream and he achieved it. Not many people can say the same. The first thing I made him do when he got home was to go to the doctor. Now he is on bed rest, going crazy from idleness, and if you can give him some task, it might help. I asked her to pass the phone to him, and after a few polite words and a brief description of his journey, I asked him to check my research and suggest ideas on how to make the work more accurate. He perked up considerably and asked me to send him my notes, promising to respond as soon as possible. Take your time, Commodore. I have a feeling this will be the best I've had in a while, and I want it to be as perfect as possible." He laughed, knowing how pedantic I could be, and we hung up. I looked at the phone for a second and decided that I would visit him as soon as possible. I chuckled, thinking that I might be being overly pedantic. I'm known for getting obsessive sometimes. I have a writer friend who I visit every time I'm in her city, most often for dinner with her family, although we occasionally go out into town. Her husband was large, moved with the grace of a cat, and had eyes that moved constantly. Constance saw me watching him one evening and grinned. "I know it's killing you, but don't ask. He won't tell you anything anyway. Let's just say he works for the government and keep it to ourselves. And don't try to get him to tell you where you think I'm getting it from. Many of your own storylines." I didn't realize how spicy he was until we were sitting after dinner drinking wine, and he looked at me and grinned. "Mozart." "What?" "You're like Mozart." Everyone was amazed at how he could write a piece of music without editing, when in fact he rewrote it in his head so many times that when it was put down on paper, it was almost perfect. Connie told me how you once wrote an entire novel while on a book signing tour with her and how easy it seemed to you. You know she agonizes over every word she writes and constantly doubts everything, while you just spill it and do it. Minor edits. Tell me, how long was your last novel written in your head before you touched the keyboard? Smiling, I told him that at least 9 months. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes when I sit down to write, I have no idea what the next character is going to say, and it leads me down all sorts of paths. The end product is sometimes nothing like what I imagined it would be. How many ideas do you have in your head right now? 5. 2 are almost ready to be put on paper, so to speak. Another one will take no more than 2 months. Connie rolled her eyes. "Ah, I hate you." "No, you don't hate. You just don't like my method. Yours works well for you, too. You have the most thoughtful plot lines I've ever seen. Your vision of where the book should go is usually spot on, but you manage to surprise the reader along the way. We often thought about working together, but I think we both knew that our styles would never match. Still, it was fun to discuss, and we would occasionally exchange ideas. They used to spend a week with me every summer. She went a little crazy when Grant and I hid her laptop after the first day, but then she relaxed and had a good time. Her boys were 9 and 11, and we spent a lot of time at the lake. It made me miss the kids, but I came to the conclusion that my future might not include a happy ending with kids and a picket fence. A month later, I was on the coast of Scotland, in a place with hills and small coves. Smuggling has been big business in the area for thousands of years and still occurs occasionally. The Commodore had a small estate that had been in the family for many generations. The death of his wife hit him hard, and he moved to America so that he would not be reminded of her everywhere. Fiona and her husband used him while he lived in the States, and shortly before he returned home, they divorced for unspecified reasons, leaving her with their son while he moved to Portugal. Ian was 12, a fiery red-haired ball of energy who never seemed tired. He took me along the ridges overlooking the ocean between sessions with his grandfather, and for his age, he knew a lot of history of the area. In fact, it gave me the kernel for my next novel. "Over there," he said, pointing down to the small cove. "The Vikings landed here in 940. They sacked the local village and took away most of the women. 3 years later, a flotilla was launched in retaliation, and they brought back the women who wanted to return, as well as a lot of Viking girls. I think they saw it as some kind of retribution. This led to raids and minor wars, and now most locals have at least some Viking DNA, and red hair has become common in parts of Scandinavia." Ian was quite sharp for a 12-year-old boy, and Fiona supported him throughout. One evening, we were sitting on their patio, using their brand new fire pit, just chatting. I praised her for her son. She was glowing. "Ah, he's a really capable guy, razor sharp if you ask me. He really likes you." "I like him too. Sometimes when we talk, I almost forget he's a child. If he had been born 2 centuries ago, he would have been a corsair. I suspect the Commodore had a lot to do with that. The Commodore would make an excellent privateer. Without a doubt, his military career has given him many chances to pretend to be one, I'm sure. He doesn't usually talk about it much, but sometimes, if he's relaxed enough and has had a couple of drinks, he'll tell stories that will make the hairs on your head stand on end. I knew. Many times when I consulted with him, it was just an excuse to have a drink and chat with him. I'm sure he told me stories that no one else had ever heard, after giving me strict warnings not to use them until after his death. Changing the subject, she talked a little about her ex. Gustav hated the sea, surprising for a Norwegian who grew up on the coast. I'm sure Viking blood runs thick in his veins. Do you know how to sail a sailboat? I go sailing whenever I can. We have a small boat, and if it was up to Ian, we'd live on it. There's nothing like being out on the open ocean, living with the wind and the currents. I'm afraid I would never make a good sailor. I get a little sick when I lose sight of the shore. My ancestors were inclined towards mountains and prairies. She started talking about my ex, so I took the plunge and asked about her marriage. She sighed. You know, it sounds corny, but we just grew apart. He gradually began to lose interest in his family and became obsessed with his career. He ended up practically living in his office when he wasn't sharing his not-so-secret apartment with his companion of the month. I finally got tired of this farce and confronted him. When I suggested a way out, he was almost pathetically quick to agree. She looked into the fire, lost for a minute. Then she continued. You know, it sounds civilized and unemotional, but it hurts. I never let anyone see it, but there were many nights when I fell asleep crying. Not so much because of him, but because of what we lost. How did Ian survive it? I think it didn't affect him as much as it did me. His dad was always a little distant and didn't spend much time with him, so when he left it barely affected him. I think maybe that was a good thing. I took a chance and leaned over, hugging her. To my surprise, she returned the hug so hard that we almost fell out of our chairs. Come on, she said, standing up and leading me to the wicker sofa. She pressed herself close to me, whispering into my chest. That's better, isn't it? It's better than better. It's great. She laughed, still not letting go of me. After about 20 minutes, she pulled away and stood up. Thank you, Miles. It's really been a long time since I've been in the arms of a man I could trust. No, don't thank me. It's been a long time since I felt this happy while holding a woman. Maybe we should hug again tomorrow to make sure it's not a fluke. Her laugh was deep and rich. I'll think about it. Now it's time to go to bed, separately. See you in the morning. She turned to leave, then turned around and fell into my lap, kissing me with passion and abandon. This probably went on for about 2 minutes before she suddenly stood up and ran into the house, leaving her laughter in the air. The next morning, she barely spoke to me, and I spent 5 hours with the Commodore, writing down stories of his long and varied military career. We finished when he said he was tired, and I went out on deck thinking about what he had told me. I looked up and saw Ian smiling. Come with me. Mom wants to show you something. He led me around the house to meet Fiona. She was wearing black leggings, sturdy boots, and a thick knitted sweater. She smiled and took my hand as Ian walked ahead of us, leading us through the moorland to the cliffs above the sea. She stopped and looked into my eyes. I want to show you something. Before I do, you must promise for everything that is dear to you, never to write or talk about it. This is a secret born here, which must remain here. It is sacred to the locals, and some may be very upset that I let a stranger see this. Promise me, Miles. I thought for a minute. I promise. I promise on my affection for you and your son, on my deep respect for your grandfather, and, above all, on my personal honor. She looked at me intently before nodding. Then she smiled. Ian, get the rope ready. Now I realized what was in his backpack. He tied the rope to a leeward tree and threw it over the edge. He smiled at me. Don't worry, there is a path, but it's very steep and you can't go wrong. Just hold on to the rope while we go down and you'll be fine. Fiona went first, and it really wasn't easy. I followed her as best I could, with Ian going last. We descended about 80 feet before stopping on a ledge about 10 feet above the sea. It was not a quiet bay, and high waves crashed against sharp rocks. Fiona walked to the edge of the ledge and just seemed to disappear. I approached and found an entrance wide enough to pass through, but the shape of the rock made it almost invisible. When Ian walked inside, she lit 2 torches and smiled. We could use electric torches, but that seemed sacrilege. Follow me. We walked about 30 feet before the passage widened into a huge cave. I heard the sound of falling water in the distance. Fiona raised the torch above her head, and it illuminated the space a little before disappearing into the black darkness. Here we are, the last refuge of Garioch. We are opposite the city itself, and this land has been in my family for centuries. No one knows who discovered it, but it became very useful when the Viking raiders appeared. The men collected women and children and brought them down from the cliffs and then hid here. Then the men fought enough to attract their attention and disappeared into the interior of the country. The raiders usually plundered everything of value and set fire to the village before leaving. There were many names and dates carved into the stone on the wall. The oldest date I saw was 1N103. Some were written in languages I didn't understand. Fiona looked serious. This is a tradition that has been going on for many centuries, as can be seen from the dates. The names of every woman and child who survived because they were able to hide here are written here. Here, in the depths, there is a spring of clear, sweet water, and they have accumulated enough supplies to last a month. They didn't leave here until the supplies ran out, or until people called them out of hiding. She led me to another part of the wall, also covered with names and dates. These are men and women who died protecting their families. Let's come here. She led me to the back corner, and I was amazed at how big the cave was. There stood a stone sofa, and on it lay the skeletal remains of a woman whose bones had been turned to stone at her final resting place. This is Agnes of Garioch. She died defending this place the only time the Vikings found it. They always kept guard, and they heard them coming. You saw how narrow the entrance was, and they held them off with arrows for 5 days before the arrows ended. Then they entered the battle to meet women and children from 12 years of age and older, armed with claymores, daggers, and spears. 43 women and 19 children fought with the Viking warriors until the last men returned, distracting some of the raiders, descended from the cliffs, and attacked them from the rear. Not a single raider got out of Scotland. The village captured their 2 ships and the treasures, which they plundered before coming here. They took the ships into the ocean and burned them, and threw them into the bay in front of the cave. Dived, you might find an artifact or 2, but the sea is so rough that you'd be risking life and limb. Agnes was the last to die, killing 2 of the raiders. They built this chair and placed on it the necklaces and rings they had captured from their enemies. Local legend says she now protects us. The treasure is still there, under the sediment that fell on it. No one would risk incurring her wrath to steal him. When did it happen? As far as we can tell, around 1996. It is still in use when during Luftwaffe bombings of nearby air bases and towns, many took refuge here. Look at this. She raised the torch again, and I saw Agnes Wallace, Jane Wallace, and Harold Wallace, 1944. My grandmother, mother, and brother. I stood there amazed, trying to absorb the history of this place. If only these walls could talk. Then I realized what they were really saying, through names and dates. Ian stood next to me, enjoying my reaction. Look here. Ian, don't, was all she managed to say before he raised his torch. It was a wall of names, a woman's name followed by a man's name. What is this? When a woman from this area wants to get married or announce her intentions, she writes her name and the name of her chosen one on this wall. Other women see this and know that the man is busy. I can show you great-great-grandmothers going back 300 years, right up to my grandmother. Fiona looked a little confused when I asked where her name was. It's not written there. Maybe it tells me that I knew it wouldn't work out between us. If I ever write my name on the wall with the name of my chosen one, it might be written in blood because it will be all over life. I marveled at the place for a few more minutes before we left. When we returned upstairs, she again asked me to make sure I kept her secret. You don't know me that well, Fiona, but I never break trust or share secrets. If anyone finds out about this place, it won't be from me. She looked into my eyes. Okay, just so you know, the cave is strictly for women. The men of our region usually see it only once. They respect the custom, and the cave is considered sacred in memory of the brave men and women, many of whom died protecting the secret. I smiled. I'll keep my word, but you know, it will torture me, thinking of all the books I could write about this place and the times it has seen. Ian walked ahead of us, stopping every now and then when something caught his attention. We talked about him, how proud she was of him, how she hoped to get him into a prestigious boarding school. She saw my furrowed eyebrow and asked. I shrugged. Different cultures, apparently. In my country, boarding schools are not that common and are mostly military academies. If I ever have children, I will want them to be as close to me as possible while they grow up. She paused thoughtfully for a minute before changing the subject. I'm worried about my grandfather. So do I, but we need to face the facts. He is almost 80, and his dream has cost him a lot. However, it was the completion of a lifelong dream. How many can say that they have actually passed the Northwest Passage? When we return, there's something I'd like to show you. I'll ask you to keep it a secret, just like you asked me. I think you'll like what you see. That night, after everyone had settled down, she knocked on my door. I had already set up my laptop and sat her down in front of it. It didn't take long before she started crying, and when the clip ended, she was sobbing, crying profusely. She settled into my arms and gave free rein to her tears, then lay down and fell silent. I showed her some pictures from the trip. Some of the images were very powerful. One in particular really touched her. It was her grandfather, standing at the helm in a storm, singing Northwest Passage as the rain and snow beat him and the wind whipped his sails. The voyage was made on a sailing ship similar to those in use at the time. In addition to sails, it had an engine, but then, like Franklin's ships, it was steam, but here it is diesel. Global warming has melted the ice enough to make travel possible, and many have already used the passage. The journey took 10 weeks in total. There were stops along the route to visit historical sites, including the island where Franklin was believed to have been buried, although no one knew the exact location. Historically, the failure of the expedition has been covered many times, with multiple expeditions launched to determine the fate of the crew, so the producers only touched on it lightly, enough to set the scene. I spent another 3 weeks before I had to leave. By this time, the Commodore was hardly out of bed, and we had many conversations, most of which I wrote down. Fiona and I were getting closer, although we hadn't crossed the line. It was very hard for me to leave, and I was surprised by the intensity of the hug I received from Ian. He became my walking companion, and we went on many long walks over cliffs and moors. He and Fiona accompanied me on several short research trips, and I enjoyed his wonder at what he saw, in the museums as well as in the field. Fiona seemed to hold on to me a little longer than usual. I made them promise to come back to me in the summer, and they made me promise to come back as often as possible. I returned home, but often found myself looking out at the lake from my office window, watching boats, especially sailboats. I finished the novel and in the preface expressed my great gratitude to the Commodore for his historical information. The book became my most successful to date, and the fight for the video rights almost drove my agent crazy, to use an old-fashioned term. Fiona and Ian gave me a very nice call, especially about the dedication. It was addressed to them and read, "This book is dedicated to Fiona and Ian Wallace. I used her maiden name. She took it back after her divorce for their contribution and support. Fiona could have been the mother of modern corsairs, and Ian would have been a distinguished sailor in another time. The tradition lives on. Winter was just beginning when I received another call from Fiona. She was crying so hard she couldn't speak, so Ian answered the phone. "Grandpa died. We need you to come home." I didn't pay attention at the time, but I thought on the plane about his words, "Come home." We spoke at least twice a week, and he became a minor celebrity when the book came out and the dedication became public knowledge. They met me on the plane, hugging me as if their lives depended on it. We returned to the estate, and I began making calls to fulfill his last wish. He wanted to be buried at sea with full naval honors. He also wanted to be buried in the traditional style, with his body sewn into a shroud with weights and sent into the depths. The morgue froze his body according to his instructions, awaiting instructions. The Commodore was in fact the captain, and the Admiralty did a brilliant job. He was taken to sea on a small warship, accompanied by a guard of honor, several old veterans who had served with him, and his family. There were no reporters, no film crew, only sailors and relatives, and he went into the depths in a ceremonial uniform, with the medals presented to him, sewn into a dark blue shroud with yellow stars. 3 symbolic cords weighed down the shroud. After the chaplain concluded the ceremony with the traditional, "We now commit your soul to the abyss," the board he was on slowly tilted, and he slid towards his final resting place. Fiona and Ian threw a wreath into the water as the ship's guns fired a traditional greeting to a sailor. He was buried in the bay of his home, and if you looked up, you could see his estate from the water. The whole city and much of the countryside lined the streets as the procession made its way to the harbor, and the boats were so thick that you could almost walk on them to the shore. The Commodore was much loved and considered a national hero. When his will was read, he left everything to Fiona and Ian, the house, his possessions and money, which turned out to be much more than expected. He left Ian all of his naval memorabilia except for one item, a naval saber that belonged to his great-grandfather, an officer in the mid-1800s, which was worn in many famous naval battles. He left it to me. He left me a little note. "I never had a son, but if I had, I would like to think that he would be a man like you. So accept it with my gratitude. I would ask for this after your passing. If you have no sons, give it to Ian. It should stay in the family." I protested, but it was not heard. "Save it. It meant a lot to him to have it as yours, and I'm sure it will stay in the family." They seemed to be at an impasse, so after arrangements were made to take care of his property, I took them home with me. Several days turned into weeks. Something had to be done about Ian's training, so I sent him to a private academy that was highly respected. It took him a while, but he adjusted to the fact that I had a lot of boys and quite a few girls under my feet on the weekends. Even at 13, his fiery red hair, natural beauty, and instinctive charm made all the girls follow him like loving puppies. Sometimes it was very amusing, sometimes it was annoying. Fiona was a little mopey, but all the children under her feet brought her out of this state. She soon became friends with mothers and began participating in school activities. I've been writing something new, something that will require a little travel, but that can wait until the summer. We settled into semi-homey bliss and bonded as a family. I was required to attend all of Ian's school events, and when one of the mothers got too close, Fiona would squeeze my hand in hers, sending a message. A month after I brought them home, we were sitting by the fire and looking at the frozen lake. Ian went to the movies with friends and stayed the night, so we had the house to ourselves. Fiona fumbled for a minute before speaking. "Miles, I need to know if you have any feelings for me, a man's feelings for a woman, because I'm falling in love with you, something I never thought I'd experience again. But you haven't given me any indication, so if you don't think so, I think Ian and I will go home." "Where are your passports?" "What?" "Where are your passports?" "They're in my room, in the dresser drawer." "Bring them, please." All sorts of thoughts must have been running through her head, but she caught them. Follow me. I took her to my bedroom and put them in the safe. Here, now you can't leave, at least not until you go through the process of getting new ones. I'm holding you and Ian hostage. It took her a second, but a smile spread across her face. Then she threw me onto the bed. Didn't expect this to happen. I also didn't see her clothes being removed in record time. Fiona was a Norse goddess. She was an inch taller than me, and I was even 6 feet tall. We were going to one of Ian's school events that required a suit and dress, and she shocked me with how good she looked. I hugged her and frowned. Where are your heels? A dress like this requires heels. I did not want. She fell silent. What didn't you want? To be taller than me? That ship has sailed, honey. Now go get your best pair and let's impress some people. Her heels were only 3 inches, but that made her, pun intended, stand head and shoulders above the rest of the women present. Some men tried to impress her, but she just smiled at them until they got nervous and left. If a woman were to approach me, the look on her face would make them think of Valkyries. All this flashed through my head when we went to bed. When she expressed her concern, I received a rather sharp blow to the back of my head and grinned. Trust me, honey, they're all wondering how tall you'd be if you were lying flat. When she was above me, kissing me and tugging at my clothes, I realized that we were absolutely the same height. We had sex as if she were a Viking warrior maiden, and I was a pagan whom she was trying to defeat in battle. However, when we finished, she turned into the biggest kitten on the planet, purring with happiness as her fingers traced patterns on the skin she touched. We fell asleep in each other's arms. We woke up at the same time and started confirming that we were sexually compatible, to the point that we were still doing it when we heard the door open. Ian came home early. Fiona rose from the bed as if it were on fire and tried to find her clothes. I put on sweatpants and a t-shirt and met him in the hallway. You come home early. Yeah, Brady got sick and his mom thought it would be a good idea to take me home. She said she called, but you guys never answered. Probably still charging. So is it contagious? Brady was the younger brother of Mike, the friend he spent the night with. She didn't think so, but decided it was better to be safe than sorry. Where's Mom? I waved my hand in the air. Oh, she's gone somewhere. Why don't you go see if she's on deck? His eyes widened and he grinned. I turned around and saw Fiona standing there, looking scared. I walked over when she started to stutter, kissed her, and spanked her toned ass. Go take a shower and get dressed. I will talk to him. What will you tell him? I'd say you're 13 now, and I'm pretty sure you know how things work. I would also tell him that I have the utmost respect for you and will not tolerate any disrespect. But you saw his grin. I think he's on board. She disappeared into her room, and I went out onto the deck. Ian sat and looked at the boats, turned and grinned. So, you and Mom. Yes, me and your mom. Will this be a problem for you? He couldn't help but smile. Not if things go the way I think they will, but it will cost you. Mom and I want a sailboat. They talked about it in general terms. I think part of it was to test how bad I wanted them to stay. We'll have lunch at the club and I'll voice this idea. He shouted with joy and began to perform the sailor's dance that the Commodore had shown him. What Ian didn't know was that he had taught me too. We were just doing high jumps, hands on hips, and as we were spinning, Fiona appeared, filming the dance on her phone. We didn't miss a single movement. At the end, we straightened up sharply and saluted carefully. She laughed and cried at the same time as she opened her arms, and we hugged her as tightly as we could. As we let go of each other and collapsed onto the lawn furniture, Ian exclaimed, "Mom, yes, Miles is going to buy us a sailboat." I said we'd look at the boats. "We'll see," I corrected gently. Fiona's face lit up with joy. "You will learn, my dear boy, that when a man says to his woman and child, 'We'll see,' it means the matter is almost decided." Pleasure shot through me like lightning. The next day, we found ourselves at the yacht club for Sunday brunch. I wasn't a member of the club, but I knew a lot of people, and it was easy to arrange an invitation, especially when I said I was looking for a boat. Fiona looked regal, for lack of a better word. Ian stood tall and proud by her side. I had a feeling that if we stayed together, I would end up in the background, but that was just fine with me. We sat at the governor's table, at his insistence, after he found out who Fiona was. Your grandfather was much loved, Miss Wallace. We miss him dearly. She thanked him, and they began discussing her grandfather's latest adventures sailing the Northwest Passage. I smiled, thinking about the documentary that was coming out next month. Much of it is dedicated to her grandfather. The final scenes showed him standing at the helm during a storm, his long white hair and beard blowing in the wind. His words were barely audible before they were covered by a version commissioned especially for the film. It was a song by Fiddler's Green, a very popular Irish band. We asked several bands to offer their versions, and the producers chose them. The final scene showed him, seen from behind, struggling with the helm to maintain course. The voices in the song soared powerfully as the screen went dark, showing his name and date of death. After brunch, we strolled around the harbor where he showed us several boats for sale. I can say that Fiona was not impressed by them. We then stopped by his office, and he showed her several that were sold locally and throughout the Southeast. He showed her one and began flipping through more. This one. I was not a boat person, but the governor later told me that this was the best of the bunch, a 38-footer with clean lines. It even had a cabin, and the sofa could be turned into a bed. It was a little more grand than I expected, but owing the bank, it felt like Fiona had the keys to the safe. We looked it over, and I wrote a check. Summer has already arrived, and we spent a lot of time on the water. The sails were raised using electric motors, but they were hardly used. I became a pretty good sailor in good weather, but if the weather turned bad, Fiona or Ian took the helm. Fiona and I often went out to sea together, and one of my fondest memories was making love in a thunderstorm while the boat rocked. We were anchored in a sheltered bay, so we were fine. That night, I gave her a ring. Before that, we went to Canada for the premiere of a documentary. It was a private screening, mostly for the cast and crew, their families, and a few invited guests. I deliberately didn't say anything to Fiona and Ian because I wanted to see their genuine reaction. This could have been a mistake. As the movie progressed, she became quieter and more motionless, squeezing our hands so tightly that I felt my blood circulation cut off. As the credits rolled, she collapsed into loud sobs. There was silence in the hall. Then the man stood up and began to sing in a loud, clear tenor. Others rose in twos and threes, and those who knew the words joined in the singing. The military veterans stood at attention and all saluted, holding the salute until the very end. I supported Fiona and saw Ian standing tall as a string, holding his own salute even as the tears flowed freely. The cameras focused on him as the song ended. As the lights came on, every person in the theater walked past Fiona and Ian, exchanging hugs, pats on the back, and words of comfort. One small woman, who must have been in her 80s, really touched her when she hugged her and stepped back. Old sea wolves never die, dear. They just go on a new journey. You'll see him one day, standing at the helm, ready to welcome you aboard. The production company set up video cameras and recording equipment to film it as a tribute to Fiona and Ian, but then asked permission to release it on YouTube, partly as a tribute, partly to promote the film. When it came out, the BBC and most American channels showed clips of people in cinemas standing up and singing together. It was especially popular in Canada when it was revealed that Nathan Rogers was part of the crew. His father, Stan, wrote Northwest Passage, which was so popular in Canada that it was considered the second national anthem. He joined for a short segment of the trip and still talks about it at his concerts. There was a segment where he sat with most of the crew singing an old sea chant. Captain Wallace was the subject of a Channel 4 documentary, and I was listed as the biographer. The film had many conversations that I recorded, all carefully vetted before permission was given, and within a year there was a movement to put his image on a postage stamp. When we finally returned to our room, she barely had time to undress before falling into a deep sleep. Ian and I sat for a while, and I asked him what he thought. I think I'd like to be with him. Because he lived in the States, I didn't get to spend much time with him, but when I was around, I could barely leave his side. He was great, wasn't he? He was a true legend, son. You have a great legacy ahead of you. Fiona was up before us the next morning, and I found her sipping tea on the terrace. Are you okay? She smiled, but it was a pale smile. Yeah, just a little overwhelmed. I don't think I mourned him enough. My father was away a lot, and he's the person I consider my real parent. Then she sat on my lap and snuggled. I have to thank you. You never said, but the film crew let me know that you financed the expedition, saying that you wanted it to be filmed, and many are adamant that it was only to fulfill my grandfather's dream. I can't express my gratitude in words. I did it because I could, and because I knew how much it meant to him. He had been trying to organize this for years. I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. You thought highly of him enough to spend $12 million on his dream. I'll never forget. I really didn't like that she knew how much I spent. I could afford it, and the estimated calculations showed that I would make a handsome profit. But the truth is, even if it was a failure, I would still do it. We spent 3 weeks on the estate before returning home. Ian returned to the joys of his youth, with caring parents and a bright future. Thanks to my condition, he would never need a job unless he wanted to, but I knew he would have some kind of career. He's simply not made for idleness. We finally talked about money when she received the ring. I don't want your money. I have my own income, so I will never be without money. I just smiled. Don't want my money, honey? Well, I'm afraid I'll have to resort to the TFB article. What the hell does that mean? It means your financial distress. You will get the money whether you like it or not, and then it will go to Ian. This topic is no longer discussed. She was still trying to say something when I left. My parents and siblings loved Fiona and Ian. As soon as they became acquainted, my mother began to drop hints. Fi and I discussed this. I was 39 and she was 36, and we both thought it was better if we didn't have children. She had problems giving birth with Ian, and doctors strongly advised her not to give birth again, saying she could, but it would be really dangerous. She cried a little about this. I've always wanted a daughter, and I'd like one with you. I waited a year before offering her an alternative. Meanwhile, we got married. Twice. Once in the States and once in Scotland. It was important to her, so I had no objections. 3 days later, she disappeared for a while and came back smiling like crazy. That evening, she showed me a photograph taken in a secret cave where our names were engraved next to her grandparents' names. You are mine for life, my dear. You didn't have to have it carved in stone for it to be true, but I admit, it's cute. My next book was something unusual for me. It was a biography of Sir Winston Stonewallis, Captain. That's right, the Commodore was a lord in the Scottish aristocracy. He laughed about it with me one day. When my ancestors came up, you could practically gain lordship for wearing your trousers correctly and having a few pounds to donate to whatever war was raging. However, in my ancestors' account, they were brave fighters. It was a slim book at only 185 pages, but I felt like I covered the main points. It sold better in the UK and Canada than domestically, but I didn't care about the profit, just the message. I dedicated it to Ian and his mother. To my son, Ian Wallace Molson, and his mother, the love of my life, Fiona Wallace Molson, worthy descendants of a proud and noble lineage. Ian came to us shortly after the wedding, wanting to know if I would agree to adopt him so that all our names would be the same. He was surprised by my answer. I want you to understand that nothing would make me prouder, but I must remind you that you are the last of the Wallace line. If you take my surname, the line will cease to exist. If you still want it, we will begin registration documents tomorrow. Fiona hugged me tightly, and her well-tuned mind came up with a solution. Since I married you, my last name is Fiona Wallace Molson. I decided to legally change my last name to Wallace Molson to honor my grandfather. Ian might do the same. That's exactly what we did, although he still went by the name Molson at school. In winter, the yacht club organized a Christmas flotilla. Each participating vessel had to be decorated with working holiday lights. It was in connection with one of their charity events, and anyone could participate, even if they weren't members of the club, but they had to pay a fee. Fee and Ian took this very seriously. They even decorated the mast and placed a full-size Christmas tree on top. We used the engines so the sails remained furled. They were then deployed to help others, and one of them was Darla. We saw each other at club events because my family insisted we join. She and her husband joined, and although he was a lawyer, he seemed a decent man and became interested in sailing. He gave her a new boat for their 3rd anniversary, almost a copy of ours. They had been married for 4 years, and Darla had just given birth to a son. She was a little old for a baby, but her health was carefully monitored, and she gave birth to a healthy boy. That's why Fee and Ian helped as she was still recovering from the birth. They were a little standoffish until Darla coaxed her to sit down for a cup of coffee. Look, you know who I am. I know who you are. I know he met you years after we broke up, so you're not a replacement. You're his wife now. A good wife, by the looks of it. We were young and stupid, well, I'm sure. And when Miles became successful, I let it go to my head. I wish I hadn't, of course, for a very long time, until I finally realized that I couldn't go back to the past and I had to look to the future. With several real losers for some time, and had almost given up when she met Rick. I told him all about our breakup, and he told me that the actions of a stupid young girl should not reflect on a mature woman, and if he couldn't trust me, we wouldn't be dating. I couldn't get his ring on my finger fast enough after that. I'm happy now, and I'm sure you are too. Then she laughed. Is he still like a kid in a candy store in bed? Worse. But you like it, don't you? Very. He comes up with something new all the time, and I never know what he's up to the next day. It gives me a lot to look forward to. So, I'm his past. You're his future. We've never crossed paths. Think you might be interested in friendship. Fi hugged her. I see some possibilities. She told me about it later, 15 minutes before Darla knocked on our door. Are you sure you don't mind? It'll only be for a few hours, and I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to it. The chance to talk to adults without keeping one ear open in case he cries will be heavenly. Oh, hi, Miles. I am already leaving. She handed me a baby carrier, kissed Fi on the cheek, and left. I looked at the sleeping baby. What was it? She smiled. Oh, didn't I tell you? We're babysitting so Darla and her husband can attend his signature Christmas party. They won't be back until midnight. Give it to me. It was a command, so I obeyed. Ian and I smiled as she rocked the baby, speaking kindly to him. She then made Ian hold him while she warmed the bottle and made me feed him. Learn for the future with your grandchildren and remember this. It was fun, but when he finished, I handed him to Fi and she walked with him, rubbing his back until he burped. Then she scrunched up her nose. Typical. What goes in, comes out. Grab the diaper bag, love. Ian took one breath and ran away. It kind of smelled like toxic waste, but Fee just smiled as she changed him and then told me to throw away the used diaper. I carried him one corner to the trash can while Fi laughed. They returned a few hours later and Darla was laughing like crazy. Fi looked at her, smiled, and told me to make coffee. Rick followed me and looked back to see them sitting on the couch together, whispering and smiling. I wonder what they're talking about. You're a lawyer, right? How long have you been married? You probably already know that the first thing married women talk about is their husbands, followed by their children. When these topics are exhausted, They move on to the next one, which is always on their mind. Sex. I have memories of the laughter Darla uses. He seemed a little shocked before he smiled. She's just been given permission to resume marital duties, as she puts it. I just hope the baby stays asleep long enough for us to get reacquainted. I smiled. Leave him here. Darla brought a bag with enough formula and diapers for a month. I'd be in the dark here, but Fee is a great mother, and she'd kill for the chance to keep him. Is it true? Yes, consultant. Really. Go home and try to break the bed. The ladies seemed to be discussing the same topic, and after about 27 kisses to her son, she kissed us both and whispered, I would never have confessed to Rick, but I think you made a good trade. He held her ass all the way to the car. Ian was now 15 and had a date with him. I don't remember any 15-year-old girls ever looking like her, and the way she filled out that sweater was hard to believe. She was a good kid, though, even if they spent most of the flotilla hidden under the covers, cuddling when they thought we weren't looking. After we returned home, she seemed depressed. We left the young doves in front of the large fireplace and retired to the den, having received instructions not to leave the room. He's growing so fast. Soon he will leave for university, and we will have an empty nest. I grinned. I wanted to talk to you about this. I know we've decided against natural births, but they don't have to be homemade. There are many children who need a loving home. If we decide to adopt a daughter, I don't think the boy can compare to Ian. Her eyes were shining with tears. If we had a boy, you would love him as much as Ian, but I like your idea of a little girl. Are you sure? How young should we get? I'm fine with a newborn or even a teenager, but would like to keep them longer. What do you think? I put my fingers to her lips. I think I should have raised this issue earlier. I vote that less is more. I even felt something. We will consider this issue after the holidays. I think it was one of the most wonderful holidays in my memory. Then Ian came up to us, wanting to talk. I thought about it a lot. I want to follow in my grandfather's footsteps and become a naval officer. I would like to go to the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, once I have completed my undergraduate degree. I have to go to school there, so I guess what I'm trying to ask is, will you send me to boarding school so I can continue working? Is this really what you want? I thought about it a lot. This is really what I want. I really don't want to go to boarding school, but I don't see any other option. Let me see if I can't come up with something. Fee cried quietly, mourning that her nest was empty too soon. There was no doubt that we would do the right thing. It turned out that the right thing to do was move back to Scotland. Fiona had no career commitments, and all I needed was a quiet space and a laptop, and I could work anywhere. We had a farewell dinner with my parents, and there were a lot of tears. Then one of the nieces asked if I would leave Brenda behind. She immediately chose Fiona as the one she loved the most, and Fi laughed about it as she stroked her under her chin and whispered to her. Ian was taller than me on the effectometer, and we almost renamed her Sea Dog because of how much she seemed to love the boat. She stood on the bow. The spray wet her lips in the rictus smile of a dog, for as long as we spent at sea. Sorry, Chrissy, but she's coming with us. There were a lot of tears at the farewell party at the yacht club, even though I explained that we would definitely be spending most of our years here. Darlene and Fee became good friends and cried in each other's arms as they said goodbye. 2 days after the party, we locked up our lake house and headed across the ocean. Ian entered a prestigious school where he could study while staying at home, and soon cute young girls were fascinated by the tanned, muscular guy. Some parents pushed their daughters to him, hoping for a profitable marriage. Fi laughed at my indignation. It's a worldwide habit, I'm afraid. Arranged marriage still exists in one form or another. Some customs never seem to die. He and the 3 girls made peace with this and demonstratively became friends in front of their parents. I worked, producing one novel and planning another. I fell in love with writing every other nautical book that people responded well to. I acquired a taste for this after a book about piracy and greed along the coast of South America. One critic called me a more polished Clive Cussler, which was hilarious and completely inaccurate. I met Mr. Cussler, and his love for the sea was miles beyond anything I could have imagined. We became such good friends that he invited me on a historical expedition through his foundation. He has discovered and recovered several shipwrecks, and I can only think of one person who could match his knowledge. The Commodore would be delighted with him. I think he considered his greatest achievement to be the raising of the Hunley, the first Confederate submarine. I was on time and couldn't go, and a few months later I read about how he found and restored 4 historic cannons used to defend New Orleans in 1812. I sent a beautiful wreath when he passed and seriously considered writing a book based on some of his exploits, but decided to put it off until a little more time had passed. We had considered adoption while we were in the S and were now repeating the process here. I started to feel discouraged about the whole process. Then Fi returned from the city with 2 cars behind her. 3 men emerged from one wearing clothes that screamed public servant in any language. 2 women in more casual clothing emerged from another, opening the doors at the back and pulling out 2 packages. The bundles turned out to be twins, just over 2 years old, who looked dazed and scared and not at all happy. Fee led everyone into the living room, a space we rarely used, more for impression than comfort. I walked out of the office and her smile could have lit up half of Scotland. Here he is. Let me introduce my husband, Miles. I introduced myself to everyone by name and shook hands, still trying to figure out what was going on. By then, Fee had both girls in her lap, hugging them. Honey, these sweet kids are Cara and Florence. Their parents died in a terrible accident, and now they are alone. I would like to make it up to you. They spent 3 hours with us while we filled out a lot of paperwork. Finally, the woman in charge of the process shook my hand. Congratulations. You are a temporary father. These girls are in your care with the prospect of full adoption. We will be checking in to see how they are doing to make sure they are safe. I have no doubt that you are up to the challenge. Good luck to you. Then they left. Fi looked at me and smiled. Congratulations, honey, we're having girls. Then her face took on a serious expression. I know this is sudden and may be shocking, but it was an opportunity I took advantage of. Their parents died in a boating accident. They had no immediate family left and would have been sent to foster care. When I heard the news, I immediately came to their office. For the first time in my life, I used my position as a lady for more than just charity work. Please don't be angry. Now I held Cara, rocking her gently, feeling the fear leave her small body. Fiona rocked Florence as tears fell from her cheeks. It's unexpected, but perfect. So pull yourself together, old maid. We've got a long way to go. By this time, the girls had fallen asleep, and we carefully put them to bed. Then she melted into my arms, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Ian returned home and heard the story. By then, the girls were awake, wandering around the room, and they soon fell in love with him, wanting to follow him wherever he went in the house. I thought it was funny, and he loved it. It took about 6 months before they realized he was their older brother, and they would wait for him at the door when he came home from class, and they would hug each other for about 15 or 20 minutes. They couldn't pronounce brother clearly, so it became Bubby. A year after we got them, Cara came running into my office screaming, "Yes, Spider, Spider!" Florence followed her. Her eyes were huge, and she grabbed my hand. The big spider was small, but ended up in their toy box and had to go. Fiona laughed as I picked him up and carried him outside. I spoke to the girls, explaining that we should not harm spiders and that spiders have a role in life. They calmed down, but still did not come close. After they returned to the playroom, Fiona approached me. "I love seeing your smile when they call you Yes. They started calling you Mom after 2 months. It took me 5. That tells me where I belong. You know, when she has a choice, Cara prefers your knee. She'll be the daddy's girl of the pair. Florence seems to prefer me, unless she's scared. Then it's all you, Spider Conqueror. A year after we took them in, they officially became Florence and Cara Wallace Molson. Ian graduated from university and entered the Royal Naval College, again as an heir. The course usually takes 39 weeks, but he opted for some advanced courses, which extended the duration to 50. As he walked across the stage as a commissioned officer, he carried the sword that the Commodore had given me many years ago. It was very emotional when I handed it to him. I can't take it. You can, and you will. It deserves to be at your side to carry on the legacy. You don't think the Commodore gave it to me to keep, do you? He gave it to me to keep, to pass on when that moment comes. It will be a burden. History will weigh on you, and I'm sure when the time comes to pass it on to your son and daughter, the weight will be even greater. The highly polished handle gleamed in the sun. He was home for a short holiday before his first assignment on a ship patrolling the North Sea. Part of his responsibilities included installing solar panels and small wind turbines on the ship to reduce energy consumption. His designs performed so well that he was transferred from ship to install systems. The girls were already 8 years old, and they clung to his legs when it was time to go to service. He sent them postcards from exotic places along with small gifts. They wrote him long letters, telling him about every event that had happened since their last message. I thought things would calm down a bit once they became teenagers. What an idiot I was. Teenage pangs, periods, boyfriends, dates that kept me awake until they got home, driving licenses. I seriously considered sending them to a monastery. Then good times will come. The hugs, the adventures, the travel made it all worthwhile. My father passed away unexpectedly, leaving my mother with nothing to do, so we brought her home for a visit. She has returned to the States 4 times in the past 6 years for important family events, mostly her grandchildren's weddings. She took the girls away for the summer and stayed at our old lake house. Fi and I enjoyed our freedom for about a week. I bet by the time they got home, they thought we were going to kill them with kisses and hugs. The twins graduated from high school and chose different universities. Cara went to St. Andrews. Florence chose Aberdeen, where she studied medicine. I think my mother's death could have triggered this. She passed away quietly, falling asleep and not waking up, at the age of 76. Fiona found her when she didn't come down for breakfast. We took her home, placed her ashes next to Daddy, then came home and placed the small part that we kept in the family crypt so that a part of her will always be with us. This was her wish, and it made Fiona very happy. The years passed. Ian married a Spanish woman he met while assigned to the embassy. It looks like his sea days are behind him. She was more than glad that he was now on dry land. He met his wife at a ball given by the embassy. She was also from the minor nobility, so they hit it off, and soon dinner turned into a quiet breakfast. When he proposed, he brought her to the estate, and she immediately hit it off with all the girls. The wedding was officiated by the ambassador, also a retired naval officer, using some forgotten law that allowed him to perform marriages. The Spanish bishop was also present to ensure that everything was legal in the eyes of her father. They honeymooned at a lake house, and the yacht club hosted a reception for them. They considered Ian one of their own, and being able to show off the couple from 2 different royal houses ensured the event was top-notch. He took her along to meet my side of the family, and although she didn't know how to feel about them at first, they got along great. She took all her cousins her age and younger shopping in New York, and by the end of the trip they would have killed her. I'm sure Conchita enjoyed having Ian at home all the time. He helped a lot with their 2 sons. When they were old enough, we took them for a few weeks each summer, and they enjoyed time with their cousins. I still write even though I'm over 70. Most of my books sell well, even if I'm not as successful as I used to be. My grandchildren insist that I tell them stories, and I have written 1 children's book for children under 10 and another for teenagers, both of which sold very well. Fiona is the grand dame of the estate, and even at her age, she is still involved in the life of the village as an advisor on children's services. We also do temporary fostering for children, but we are too old to admit another child permanently. 2 summers ago, we rented a large cruise boat in Maryland and sailed down the intracoastal waterway to Florida with our 2 oldest grandchildren as crew, meeting up at Disneyland with the rest of the family for a week before returning home. All the children and grandchildren gathered in the house to celebrate their grandmother's 70th birthday. We had a tradition of watching a documentary about their great-grandfather at least once every time we were all together. We then showed clips of Cara and Florence when they were teenagers, dressed in sailor costumes and doing the sailor dance at various Highland games. They had a cabinet full of trophies for this and for sword dancing. All the grandchildren learned the dance, and we always danced it together at family gatherings. Ian then led them in the sea shanty. If we were a little under the weather, the songs became a little bolder towards the end. The children giggled and sang at the top of their lungs. Fee went inside, and when she came back, we were right in the middle of what to do with a drunken sailor. Miles, I smiled and grabbed the love of my life, spinning her around in the firelight until she laughed. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.